In the heart of the eastern highlands of Nigeria, where the morning mist clings to ancient trees like the whispers of forgotten ancestors, there lies a village called Armakuku. From a distance, it appears like any other. Mud houses with corrugated iron roofs, children chasing chickens through dusty paths, and the eternal rhythm of pestle against mortar as women prepare the evening meal. But Armakuku harbors secrets, a very deep secrets, buried beneath its red earth, that even the baobab trees, ancient witnesses to centuries of human folly, seem to lean away from certain plots of land. For in this quiet village, curses are passed down like family heirlooms, and sins echo through generations, like thunder in a valley. This is the story of what happens when the gods grow tired of waiting for justice. And this is the story of Ardora and her child, a child born with two heads, two souls, and a destiny that would shake the very foundations of everything. The villagers believed they knew about good and evil. Ardora was 28 years old when this story truly begins, though her journey started much earlier. She stood barely 5 feet tall. She was a woman who had learned to swallow her tears in silence. In Armakuku, she was known as the gentle teacher, the one who never raised her voice at the children in the village school, the one who would walk miles to tutor a slow learner. She is the kind of woman whose laugh could make even the grumpiest elder smile. She was married to Obinna, a man so strong and powerful that he can uproot yams from the most stubborn soil. But for 7 long years of trying, hoping, praying, he was unable to have a child with his wife Ardora. In that 7 years of Ardora's marriage with Obinna, she visited native doctors, pastors, and powerful spiritual men. Each one promised that this time, this new concoction, this special prayer, would unlock her womb. But her very first pregnancy lasted for months. Ardora had just begun to show, and had just started buying tiny clothes from the market, when she woke up one morning to find blood staining her wrapper. The midwife, Mama Favor, held her hand and whispered, "Sometimes, my daughter, the ancestors are not ready to send the child." But then the second pregnancy lasted 6 months. This time, Ardora had felt the baby move, and had spoken to it in the quiet hours before dawn. She told the stories of the village, and its father's gentle nature, and the love that was waiting for its arrival. But then, she had another miscarriage. When she lost that one too, Obinna found her by the stream, staring into the water as if she was searching for answers in its depths. Ardora conceived again, but this time, the third pregnancy nearly killed her. She had carried the baby to 8 months. The whole village had rejoiced. Surely this time, Ardora's curse would be broken. But when the labor pains began, something went wrong. The baby came out blue and silent. Its tiny body was perfect, but lifeless. And Ardora hemorrhaged so badly that for 3 days, she danced between the world of the living and the realm of the ancestors. When she finally opened her eyes, the first thing she saw was Obinna's tear-stained face. "I'm sorry," she whispered, but her voice hoarse from fever dreams. Obinna took her hand and pressed it to his lips and said, "Don't apologize for carrying pain. That isn't yours to carry, my wife." Yet even as he spoke these kind words, Ardora could see something had changed in his eyes. A small door had closed, and she wasn't sure if it would ever open again. 2 years passed like seasons of drought. But Ardora threw herself into teaching, staying late at the school to prepare lessons, volunteering to organize the children's cultural presentations. She does anything to keep her mind from dwelling on the emptiness that seemed to echo through her house. Few months later, then came the Festival of Masks. But this festival occurs once every 3 years in Armakuku. The festival was a tradition older than the oldest man in the village could remember. It was said that during this festival, the veil between the world of the living and the world of the spirits grew thin, and those who knew how to look could glimpse their destinies in the swirling smoke of the sacred fire. The entire village had been preparing for weeks. Young men carved elaborated masks from Irako wood. Their hands were guided by techniques passed down through generations. Women brewed palm wine that would make even the ancestors dance. Children practiced traditional songs until their voices could harmonize with the evening wind. Ardora had always loved the festival, but this year, She felt disconnected from the celebration. She sat at the edge of the great circle, where the villagers had gathered, watching the masked dancers spin and leap in the firelight. Their dancing movements tell stories of creation, of love, loss, and rebirth. The drums pounded a rhythm that seemed to match Ardora's heartbeat, and the smoke from the sacred fire made shapes in the night air. But then something strange happened. It was then that she felt a hand on her shoulder. Ardora turned to find an old woman beside her, someone she had never seen before. The woman's hair was as white as a cotton, and was plated with cowrie shells. Her skin was dark and deeply lined, but her eyes seemed to hold the wisdom of centuries. "You are the teacher who has no children," the old woman said. It wasn't a question. Ardora nodded. Suddenly, she was unable to speak. The old woman looked at her and studied her face for a long moment. Then she looked up at the sky and said to Ardora, "Your womb is not barren, child. It is guarded." Ardora responded with a shocking face and said, "Guarded?" But then the old woman replied, "Your family line carries a debt, a spiritual debt that has compounded with interest for over 100 years. The ancestors who were wronged have blocked your womb until justice is served." Ardora was shocked for a moment, as her heart was beating fast. Then she replied, "What kind of debt? What justice?" The old woman smiled, but it was not a comforting expression. She said to Ardora, "Land was stolen. Lives were destroyed. Truth was buried for a long time. But the gods grow impatient, and they have decided to offer you a choice." She reached into her wrapper and withdrew a small gourd. Its surface was carved with strange symbols. She then offered it to Ardora and said, "Drink this under the full moon, and you will conceive. But know this. The child who comes will not be like other children. He will carry the weight of your family's sins and the power to cleanse them. He will be born to reveal what has been hidden, to restore what has been stolen." Ardora stared at the gourd and said, "What do you mean, not like other children?" But when she looked up, the old woman was gone. Ardora searched the crowd frantically, asking others if they had seen the old woman with the cowrie shells in her hair. But everyone looked at her strangely. "What old woman, Sister Adora? You've been sitting alone all evening." That night, Ardora couldn't sleep. She lay in bed beside Obinna, who was snoring softly after too much palm wine, and turned the small gourd over and over in her hands. In the moonlight streaming through their window, the carved symbols seemed almost alive. Ardora thought for a moment, and said to herself, "What if it's poison? What if it's just the cruel joke of someone who knows about my pain?" But then, she remembered the woman's eyes, ancient, knowing, sad. Those weren't the eyes of someone who meant harm. Finally, unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, Ardora slipped out of bed and walked to their backyard. The full moon hung directly overhead, so bright that it cast clear shadows on the ground. But then, Ardora could hear the night sounds of the village, a dog barking in the distance. She uncorked the gourd and sniffed its contents. The liquid inside smelled of herbs she couldn't identify. It was sweet and bitter at the same time, like hope mixed with fear. She then whispered to the moon ancestors and said, "If this is your will, then let it be." She drank the entire contents in one gulp. The liquid burned going down, then seemed to spread warmth throughout her entire body. For a moment, she felt dizzy, as if the world was spinning around her. Then suddenly, she felt more awake than she had ever been in her life. Ardora began to see something strange. It was two moons hanging in the sky. She blinked, certain she was hallucinating, but the second moon remained. It was smaller than the first, and it seemed to pulse with a reddish light. As she watched, both moons began to move across the sky, dancing around each other in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. The world around her began to change. The familiar landscape of her village faded, and she found herself standing in a forest she had never seen before. Ancient trees stretched impossibly high above her. Their branches intertwined to form a canopy, so thick that only fragments of moonlight filtered through. And there, at the base of the largest baobab tree she had ever seen, she heard crying. Adora walked toward the sound. Her bare feet was silent, on a carpet of leaves that glowed with their own inner light. As she approached the tree, She saw a baby, maybe 6 months old, sitting alone in the grass. But this was no ordinary child. The baby had two heads. The left head was crying, its face scrunched up in sorrow, tears streaming down chubby cheeks. The right head was laughing, its mouth open in pure joy, eyes sparkling with mirth. The crying head had eyes, just like the color of a deep water, blue-black like the sky before dawn. The laughing head had eyes, just like the color of a fire, red-gold like sunset. Ardora felt no fear, only overwhelming love. She knelt down and gathered the child into her arms. And immediately, both heads turned to look at her. The crying stopped. The laughing continued, but softer now, more like contentment than wild joy. "My son," she whispered, and somehow she knew this was true. The child, her child, reached up with tiny hands and touched her face. When he did, Adora saw flashes of images, like lightning illuminating a dark landscape. European colonizers, dividing land that didn't belong to them, documents signed in blood, families torn apart, sacred groves cut down to make room for coffee plantations, traditional rulers stripped of their power and left to die in poverty. And through it all, she saw her own ancestors. Not as the humble farmers she had always believed them to be, but as intermediaries who had helped the colonizers steal land from neighboring villages, who had grown rich by betraying their own people. She then heard a voice that said, "The sins of the fathers shall be visited upon the children, until justice is served," though she couldn't tell if it came from the child or from the tree itself. Ardora woke up the next morning in her own bed, wondering if it had all been a dream. But deep in her belly, she felt something new, a warmth, a presence, a life beginning to take root. 2 weeks later, she missed her monthly cycle. For weeks later, the village midwife confirmed what Ardora already knew in her heart. She was pregnant. The news spread through Armakuku like wildfire. After 7 years of barrenness, Ardora was finally expecting a child. The village women brought her gifts. Yam tubers, to ensure the baby would be strong. They also brought kola nuts, to ensure it would be wise, and palm oil, to ensure its skin would glow with health. Obinna was overjoyed. The door that had closed in his eyes flung wide open again, and he treated Ardora like she was made of precious glass. He built a new addition to their house for the baby's room. He painted their entire home. He even slaughtered a goat to thank the ancestors for their blessing. But as the months passed, Ardora began to have strange experiences. She would wake up to find her belly warm to the touch, as if a fire burned within. Sometimes late at night, she could swear she heard voices, not the single voice of one unborn child, but a conversation, as if two people were talking inside her womb. Her pregnancy was unlike anything the village midwives had ever seen. By the 6th month, Ardora's belly was enormous, far larger than it should have been for a single child. When the baby moved, it felt like a wrestling match was taking place inside her. But the head midwife in Armakuku village said, "Ardora, you're carrying twins, my daughter. That's why you're so large." But Ardora knew it wasn't twins. In her dreams, she still saw the child from the forest. One body, two heads, eyes of water and fire. The dreams became more frequent as her due date approached. She saw the child grown older, sitting under the same baobab tree, speaking to spirits that only he could see. She saw him walking through the village, and wherever he went, people began confessing secrets they had hidden for years. She saw him touching the earth, and crops that had failed for generations suddenly flourished. And she saw the fear in people's eyes when they looked at him. On the night she went into labor, a storm unlike any in living memory struck Armakuku. Lightning split the sky in patterns that looked almost like writing. Thunder shook the foundations of houses. The wind howled through the village, like the voices of 1,000 ancestors crying for justice. Mama Favor and 2 other midwives had come to help with the delivery, but as Ardora's labor progressed, they began to look at each other with worried glances. "Something is not right," Mama Favor whispered to her assistant. "I've delivered hundreds of babies, but I've never felt energy like this." The room itself seemed alive. Shadows danced on the walls, despite the steady flame of the kerosene lamp. The temperature kept fluctuating, now hot as a forge, now cold as morning mist. And there was a sound, barely audible, like voices chanting in a language none of them recognized. When the baby finally came out, Mama Favor gasped. She could see hair, but not the normal single crown of hair that marked a baby's head. There were two distinct patches, growing in different directions. "Push, my daughter," she urged Ardora, but her voice shook. "Push now." With a final, tremendous effort, Ardora brought her child into the world. And the world was never the same. The baby emerged in a rush of blood and fluid, and for a moment, the midwives could only stare in shock. The child was perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, a strong, healthy body that glowed with life. But he had 2 heads. The left head immediately began to cry. Its voice was strong and clear. The right head opened its mouth and laughed, a sound of pure joy that somehow harmonized perfectly with its siblings' tears. The left head's eyes were a deep blue-black of still water. The right head's eyes glowed red-gold like coals. "Mama Favor" screamed. Her assistants stumbled backward, one of them falling to the floor in her haste to get away from the child. One of the midwives shouted, "Abomination! It's an abomination!" But Ardora, exhausted from the birth, but filled with overwhelming love, reached for her son and said, "Give him to me, give me my child." When the baby was placed in her arms, both heads turned to look at her. The crying stopped. The laughing softened to a contented gurgle. And Ardora felt a peace she had never known before. She then whispered, "My son, my beautiful son." Outside, the storm suddenly ceased. The wind died. The lightning stopped. And in the supernatural silence that followed, the entire village seemed to hold its breath. The news of the 2-headed baby spread through Armakuku faster than flames. By sunrise, a crowd had gathered outside Ardora's house, not to celebrate, but to gawk, to whisper, to judge. The midwives, still in shock from what they had witnessed, told anyone who would listen about the unnatural birth. They spoke of the shadows that danced without flame, and the voices that chanted in an unknown language. The midwives also spoke about the very air that seemed to vibrate with otherworldly energy. But Mama Favor was still shocked about her experience and said, "It is not human. I have seen twins joined at the hip, twins joined at the back, but never have I seen one body with 2 heads. This is not the work of nature." Chief Mardu, the head of the village council, and descendant of the traditional rulers, called an emergency meeting for that very evening. All adult members of the village were required to attend. Ardora, still weak from childbirth, stayed home with her son. She had named him Chijindu, God holds life, and she refused to let anyone else hold him. When visitors came to see the child, she kept him wrapped in a cloth, showing only glimpses of his face. But those glimpses were enough to send most people away, shaking their heads and muttering prayers. Obinna, meanwhile, was struggling. On one hand, this was the child he had prayed for, the child he had dreamed of for 7 years. On the other hand, the way people looked at his family now, the way conversations stopped when he approached, the way children ran from his house, it was almost unbearable. At the village meeting, held under the great Irako tree, where all important decisions were made, Chief Mardu stood before the assembled crowd, with the gravity of a man delivering a death sentence, and said, "My people, we face a situation that has never occurred in the history of our village. A child has been born among us, who defies the natural order. A child with 2 heads. But people in the crowd began to murmur. Then he continued, "Our ancestors have always taught us that such births are omens, signs of great misfortune to come. In the old days, such children were not allowed to live, for they bring curses upon the entire community." From the back of the crowd, someone shouted, "What if it's not a curse? What if it's a blessing?" Chief Mardu's eyes hardened, and then he said, "A blessing? Have you seen this child? One head cries while the other laughs. One eye is blue, the other red. This is not nature, my brother. This is the work of evil spirits." Father Andrew, the Catholic priest who served 3 villages, including Armakuku, stood up and said, "As a man of God, I must say that all children are blessings from the Almighty. But I have tried to bless this child, and when I touched him, I was overcome. I saw visions, heard voices. I fainted, and did not wake for 3 days." The crowd gasped. Father Andrew was known for his strong faith, and his ability to drive out evil spirits. But then Chief Mardu asked, "Father Andrew, what kind of visions was that?" Father Andrew's face grew pale, as he said, "I saw the past. Things that happened in this village long before I was born. Things that were buried and forgotten. And I heard voices accusing, demanding justice for wrongs that were never made right." Then an old woman in the crowd, the oldest person in the village, a woman called Mama Isa, who claimed to remember when the British first came, suddenly stood up on shaking legs and said, "I know what child this is. My grandmother told me stories her grandmother told her. There was a prophecy made by the last traditional priest before the British killed him. He said that when the land cried out for justice, when the sins of betrayal grew too heavy to bear, the gods would send a special child. A child who could see the past and the future at the same time. A child with the eyes of truth." The crowd fell completely silent. And then the old woman continued to speak. She said, "My grandmother said this child would have two heads, one to mourn what was lost, one to celebrate what would be restored. And he would come to a family that carried the greatest burden of guilt." All eyes turned toward the path that led to Ardora's house. Chief Mardu's face hardened, and then he said, "Mama Isa, with respect, you are old, and your memory plays tricks. There is no such prophecy." But the old woman smiled, an expression both sad and knowing. Then she responded, "Chief Mardu, your great-grandfather knew the prophecy well. He was there when it was made. He was one of the men who decided to bury it. As baby Chijinda grew, so did the strangeness surrounding him. At 3 months old, while other babies could barely hold up their heads, both of Chijinda's heads were alert and focused. The crying head, which Ardora began to think of as sorrow, would fix its blue-black eyes on people and seem to peer into their souls. The laughing head, which she called joy, would giggle at things no one else could see, as if invisible friends were telling him wonderful jokes. At 6 months, when most babies were just beginning to babble, Chijinda spoke his first words, but not in the way other children did. Ardora was feeding him one morning, when Sorrow looked up at her and said, "Mama, why do the ancestors cry?" Ardora nearly dropped the bowl of pap she was feeding him, but with surprise in her eyes she replied, "What did you say, my son?" But it was Joy who answered, with his red-gold eyes sparkling with mirth. "They cry because their children forgot the truth, Mama, but they laugh because soon everyone will remember." The conversations continued to develop. By 9 months, both heads would recite proverbs that Ardora had never heard before, speaking in harmonies that made the hair on her arms stand up. They would sing songs in a languages that sounded like Igbo, but weren't quite, older versions perhaps, or dialects that had been lost to time. The most unsettling thing was how they seemed to know things they couldn't possibly know. One day, Ardora's neighbor, a woman named Ifeoma, came to visit. She had always been kind to Ardora, even after Chijinda's birth, and she brought gifts of food and baby clothes. But as soon as she entered the room, where Chijindu was lying in his crib, both heads turned to look at her. Sorrow began to cry. Not the normal cry of a baby, but a mournful wailing that seemed to come from somewhere much deeper than his small lungs. Joy stopped laughing entirely and stared at Ifeoma with those unsettling red-gold eyes. But Ifeoma was clearly uncomfortable. Then she asked, "What's wrong with him?" It was then that Chijinda spoke, both heads in unison, their voices harmonizing in a way that made the windows rattle. "The medicine you gave your husband last week was not palm wine, Mama Ifeoma. And the baby you lost 2 years ago was not miscarried. It was born alive, and you buried it by the river, because it was not your husband's child." Ifeoma went white as cotton, and then she stammered, I don't know what you're talking about." But Sorrow continued, tears streaming down his face as he said, "The baby cries for proper burial, Mama Ifeoma. His spirit cannot rest in an unmarked ground." Then the other baby's head, Joy's voice instantly became sad, instead of merry, as he said, "Your husband knows, Mama. He has always known. He drinks the palm wine you poison, because he loves you, but his body grows weak. Soon he will die, and then you will carry 2 deaths instead of 1. Ifeoma fled the house, and within a week, The entire village knew that she had confessed everything to her husband. The baby was exhumed and was given a proper burial rites. Ifeoma sought forgiveness from her husband and the ancestors. And remarkably, her husband's mysterious illness, the one that had been slowly killing him for 2 years, began to improve. Word of Chijindu's gift spread to neighboring villages. As Chijindu approached his 2nd birthday, the supernatural occurrences in Ardora's house intensified. Every night, without fail, the house would begin to shake around midnight. Not violently, but with a gentle, rhythmic trembling, as if enormous feet were walking around the building. Ardora would wake to find symbols drawn on the walls, not scratched or painted, but somehow pressed into the mud walls, as if invisible hands had molded them there. The symbols were intricate and beautiful, resembling nothing Ardora had ever seen in any book or traditional art. They seemed to glow with their own inner light, and when she traced them with her finger, they felt warm to the touch. Father Andrew, still struggling with his experience of fainting for 3 days after touching the baby, finally worked up the courage to visit again. This time he came with holy water, a crucifix, and prayers of protection. But when he entered the house, he stopped dead in his tracks. The symbols on the walls were moving. Not quickly, but slowly, like living things growing and changing before his eyes. And they were forming letters, not in English or Igbo, but in Latin. Veritas libera vivo, which means, read one wall. Truth will set you free. Another one appeared on the wall. Peccata patrum, which means, read another. The sins of the fathers. And then another symbols appeared again. Tempus Judicii. And it means, read a third. The time of judgment. Father Andrew's hands shook so badly that he could barely hold his crucifix. And then he said, Ardora, this house, it's become a sacred place. But I cannot tell if it's sacred to God or to something else. As if in response to his words, both of Chijindu's heads turned toward the priest. The 2-year-old was sitting on the floor, playing with wooden blocks that seemed to arrange themselves into patterns without his help. With the head carrying impossible wisdom, the baby's sorrow head said, God and the ancestors are not enemies, Father. They work together to bring justice. Then the other head, Joy, nodded in agreement, his laughter temporarily subdued, as he said, The white man's God and our ancestors' spirits drink from the same river of truth, Father. Only men build walls between them. Father Andrew sank into a chair, overwhelmed, and said, But the child, how does he know these things? How does he speak like a scholar, when he's barely learned to walk? It was then that Ardora noticed something that made her blood run cold. Chijindu wasn't casting a shadow. Despite the bright afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows, despite the kerosene lamp burning on the table, the child cast no shadow on the floor. It was as if light passed right through him. Then Ardora whispered, Father, pointing to where her son's shadow should have been, and said, Look. Father Andrew followed her gaze and gasped. But before he could respond, the house filled with voices. Not the voices of the living, but the harmonious chorus of the dead. They sang in languages that predated colonization, in melodies that seemed to rise from the very earth beneath the house. And as they sang, the temperature in the room dropped dramatically, their breath becoming visible in the suddenly frigid air. Chijindu began to sing along, both heads harmonizing with the invisible choir. His small voice blended perfectly with the ghostly chorus, as if he had been practicing with them for years. The song told a story of land stolen, of treaties broken, of sacred groves destroyed, to make way for coffee plantations. It told of families torn apart, of traditional rulers stripped of their power, of people forced to work their own ancestral land as laborers for foreign owners. And it told of those who had helped the colonizers, those who had betrayed their own people for money and small measures of power. When the song ended, the house fell silent. The temperature returned to normal. The symbols on the walls faded until they were barely visible. But the message was clear. The time for silence was ending. When Chijindu turned 5, his reputation had spread far beyond Armakuku. Stories of the two-headed child, who could see into people's hearts, who spoke with the voices of ancestors, who revealed hidden truths, had reached the state capital. While some people dismissed the stories as rural superstition, others were intrigued, and a few were very, very afraid. Governor Paul was one of those who was afraid. He was a man who had built his political career on secrets, election fraud, embezzlement, connections to drug cartels, and darker crimes that he thought were buried forever. When his advisors told him about the strange child in Armakuku, he laughed it off. But when his own daughter disappeared, his laughter died. Chioma Paul, the governor's daughter, was 13 years old. She was the governor's pride and joy, a brilliant girl who attended the best private schools and had dreams of becoming a doctor. On a Tuesday morning in November, she simply vanished from her boarding school in Lagos. No ransom note, no trace of forced entry, no evidence of where she might have gone. The governor mobilized the entire state police force. He hired private detectives. He offered a reward that could buy a house. But after 3 weeks, there were no leads, no clues, no hope. It was then that his personal spiritual advisor, a man called Prophet Jeremiah, came to him with an unusual suggestion. He said, "Governor, there is a child in Armakuku village who is said to see things others cannot see. Perhaps." Governor Paul was desperate enough to try anything. On a Thursday morning, a convoy of black SUVs rolled into Armakuku, stirring up clouds of dust and sending chickens squawking in all directions. The governor himself stepped out of the lead vehicle, flanked by bodyguards and government officials. The entire village came out to see what was happening. Never before had such important people visited their small community. Chief Mardu hurried forward, bowing deeply. "Your Excellency, you honor us with your presence. How may we serve you?" Governor Paul was a tall man with graying hair, and the kind of commanding presence that came from wielding power. But today that presence was undermined by the haunted look in his eyes. Then he answered, "Chief Mardu, I have come to see the child, the one they call the two-headed seer." A murmur ran through the crowd. Even Chief Mardu looked uncomfortable, as he said, "Your Excellency, the child is unusual. Perhaps it would be better if—" "Take me to him now," the governor interrupted. Reluctantly, Chief Mardu led the procession to Ardora's house. The crowd followed at a distance, everyone wanting to see what would happen when the most powerful man in the state met the most unusual child in the village. Ardora was in her garden when she saw the convoy approaching. She quickly gathered 5-year-old Chijindu in her arms and brought him inside. Her heart was racing. When the knock came at her door, she knew there was no avoiding it. Governor Paul entered her humble home with his entourage, and immediately, the small space felt overcrowded and tense. But when his eyes fell on Chijindu, something in his expression changed. The child sat calmly on a wooden stool, both heads regarding the governor with interest. Sorrow's blue-black eyes seemed to look right through him, while Joy's red-gold eyes sparkled with what might have been amusement. "So you are the famous two-headed child," the governor said, his voice slightly hoarse. Both heads nodded in unison. Then the governor continued, "I have come to ask for your help. My daughter is missing. If you can truly see things others cannot see, perhaps you can tell me where she is." For a long moment, Chijindu said nothing. Then the sorrow head began to weep, great, heart-wrenching sobs that filled the small room with the sound of pure grief. "She is not missing, Governor," Sorrowhead said through his tears. "She is dead." The governor staggered backward, as if he had been struck, and then said, No, that's not possible. She's just missing. She'll come home." Joy's laughter filled the room, but it was bitter, knowing laughter. "Governor, you know where she is. You have always known." "I don't know what you're talking about." Both heads spoke in unison, their voices harmonizing in a way that made the walls of the house vibrate. "The foundation of your mansion in Abuja. The concrete was poured on a Tuesday night, in September, 2 years ago. She was 13 then, too. Your own flesh and blood, sacrificed for power that will never satisfy the hunger in your soul." Governor Paul went white, then gray, then collapsed to his knees. The truth hit him like a physical blow, and suddenly he was seeing visions, not of the future, but of the past, of the night 2 years ago, when his spiritual advisor had told him that ultimate power required ultimate sacrifice, when he had made the most horrible decision of his life, when he had convinced himself that it was all for the greater good, when he had buried the truth so deep he had almost made himself believe his own lies. With tears streaming down on the sorrow's head face, he said, "She haunts you. She comes to you in dreams, asking why, asking how her own father could do such a thing." And then Joy, the other head, said, "She will never stop coming, not until justice is served." Governor Paul collapsed completely, sobbing like a child. His bodyguards stood frozen, unsure what to do. His advisors looked at each other in horror. And in that moment, everyone in the room understood that they were witnessing something far beyond the natural world. They were seeing the naked truth laid bare, justice demanding its due, the past refusing to stay buried.